Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lesson we are going to start the implementation of our loading indicator solution. As we will see, by adopting a reactive design, we are going to make it very simple for different components at different levels of the Angular component tree to easily interact with the loading component in a decoupled way. Let's start at the beginning. Let's first define here some HTML for our component. We are going to be defining here the loading indicator component by using the Angular material spinner component. And we are going to be wrapping this component into a container to which we are going to be adding some styles of our own. Let's then define here a div. We are going to be adding it a CSS class that we are going to be calling spinner container. So the spinner container class is already available here in our loading component.css file. And as we can see, these styles that we are applying here are going to give to the loading indicator a background with a gray color that is going to occupy the whole screen. And the loading indicator itself is going to be a spinning wheel that we're going to see here on the center of the screen. Let's then go back here to our template. We're going to take the material spinner and we are going to place it inside our gray background container. Let's now discuss how this loading indicator is going to be used in our application. So as you can see, this has a selector named loading. So with the loading tag, we can add this loading indicator anywhere on the application, but in practice, we're going to be adding only one instance of this component and we're going to add it here at the level of our application root component. So if we open our root component, we're going to see that here we have the material top menu that we see here linked to this hamburger menu. And we also have here the main router outlet of our application. So this is where top level components such as, for example, the home component or the course component are going to be displayed here in the middle of the screen, just below our material side menu. Now the loading indicator instance that we're going to add to our application is going to sit here just on top of the router outlet. If any component on the application needs to display briefly the loading indicator, that component, such as for example the home component or the edit course dialog component, needs to somehow send a message to the loading indicator component and inform it that the loading indicator should be displayed. Otherwise, in general, the loading indicator should be hidden. Now the question is, because this loading indicator is here at the level of the application root component, we can now ask ourselves, how will the home component, which sits at a completely different level of the Angular component tree, how will the home component, whenever it's loading a list of courses from the backend, be able to notify the loading component that is in a completely different part of the application that the loading indicator should be displayed or that it should be hidden because the loading of the courses is already completed. The way that these two components at very different levels of the component tree can easily interact with each other is via using a shared service that we're going to be calling the loading service. Let's now define the API of this service. Let's start first by creating here a new file, loading.service.ts, that we're going to create here inside the loading folder. Inside it, we're going to be defining here a new class. We're going to call it loading service. We're going to make this an Angular service by adding it the injectable decorator, but let's leave the injectable decorator with its default configuration. So unlike, for example, here the courses service, we won't be defining the provided in property and we won't be setting it to root either. So this is used in the case that we want to make the service a global singleton, meaning that there is only one instance of the service on the whole application. That will not be the case, however, of the loading service. The loading service might potentially have multiple instances in our application. We might want to use a loading indicator, for example, locally at the level of a form in our page to indicate that some operation is taking place on the background, but we might not want to block the whole user interface with a global loading indicator like when, for example, we are loading courses from the backend. We might have the need in our application for small loading indicators that are local to a given component. Because we have not defined here the provided in property in our injectable decorator, we now need to define where this service is going to be available in our dependency injection tree. So going back here to our application component, we're going to be adding here on the providers of this component an instance of the loading service. This means that this instance of the loading service is going to be visible only to the application component and to its child components. Now let's talk about how will this loading service enable the communication between the loading component and other parts of the application that want to display a loading indicator. Well, the loading service is going to get injected both on the loading component and into any other components that need to show a loading indicator. Let's start by injecting the loading service here. We are going to define here a member variable that we're going to call loading service, and we are going to apply it the type loading service. Now let's go to another place on the application that has the need of displaying a loading indicator to the user. One such example is going to be, for example, the home component. The home component is responsible for fetching the list of courses from the backend. So here we want to be able to show a loading indicator to the user while the loading takes place. For that, we have injected here the loading service. Now, another component in our application that needs a loading indicator is the edit course dialog that we see here on the screen. Let's open this new component. We are going to be using Command-Shift-O, and let's look here for our course dialog component. Here in our constructor, we are going to be injecting here also the loading service. As we can see, using the Angular dependency injection mechanism, which allows us to inject any dependencies that a component needs directly in the constructor without knowing where the dependencies come from. Using this mechanism, we can very easily inject a shared service at different levels of the component tree. Let's now talk about the design of the loading service. The loading service, as we will see, is going to be adopting a reactive design, and this is going to make it very simple for components at different levels of the component tree to be able to interact with each other in a decoupled and maintainable way.